Good afternoon. I'm Michael Popa, Executive Director of the Mainstream Coalition, and welcome to the fourth installment in our Continuing the Conversation series, What We've Learned So Far. Continuing the Conversation is a platform to help amplify Black voices. And over the past several weeks, we've heard from Black community leaders and activists on the topics including white privilege, unconscious bias, and just how deeply ingrained racism is in our society. And through these conversations, we've listened and we've acted and we've educated ourselves. So now it's time for us to have a very important discussion on what we've learned, where we are now, and how we as white allies can continue to support our friends in the Black community and fight to end systemic racism. Today, I'm joined by a panel of individuals who come from different backgrounds and perspectives to discuss our experiences and awakenings following the murders of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and countless others. Our guests today are Laura Wasmer. Laura is the former mayor of Prairie Village, serving from 2015 to 2019. Prior to that, she served on the Prairie Village City Council for 17 years. Her professional background includes a 14-year career with Hallmark Cards in marketing, strategic communications, and corporate training, as well as an instructor and career coach. And as a national award-winning residential loan officer, Laura currently serves as an advisory board member of KCUR Public Radio and volunteers her time to local initiatives. Welcome, Laura.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Excellent. Glad to have you. And next we have Amy Axtown. Amy's a proud stay-at-home mom and active community volunteer. She earned her Bachelor of Arts in Studio Art from Coe College, and most recently a Bachelor of Arts in Education and Visual Arts from UMKC, along with her K-12 Missouri Art Educator certification. Her professional background includes a career in education and as the Director of Communications and Membership for the Morningside Neighborhood Association. Amy is the former Kansas City Community Outreach Lead and current Missouri Twitter lead for Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America. Welcome, Amy.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. And last but not least, we have John Pauldine. John joined the Voter Network, Mainstream's C3 affiliate organization, in March of 2019 as our youth engagement coordinator after working on a successful local mayoral campaign. In his position now, he helps to foster a culture of voting among Kansas's newest voters and increase youth voter turnout across Kansas with our Voter to Voter project. John hopes the next generation of Kansas voters will help create responsible and responsive government across the state, and so do all of us. John, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Of course. So as I mentioned in that opening, we all come from different backgrounds. We've all had some different experiences over the last couple of months. So I'd like to go ahead and jump in and find out what we've learned as white allies so far about what is racism, because there's a lot of different perceptions, a lot of different definitions out there, if you will. But what have we learned from listening to our friends talk? And I'll throw that out there for anyone.
I'll jump in. I mean, I think most of us have felt that racism was more of an act of hatred. You know, that's sort of the definition that I know I grew up with, was being taught, you know, to be nice to everyone, to be kind to everyone. And being a racist was, you know, saying something mean, or, you know, a police brutality act was racism. And I think the more I've been educated based on what I've been reading and hearing, I understand the entire system of racism that we have, that affects literally everything, you know, from school to housing to job opportunities to economic development, and especially the justice system, or the injustice system, as I'll refer to it these days. But there are just so many issues. It's such a systemic issue. It's embedded in literally every part of our society. So it's really a big, big issue.
I think
you mentioned, I'm sorry, Amy, please.
I was just saying, I feel like I've learned a lot about the history that I was taught in schools versus the actual history of our country, and how America's just completely built on racism. and how we wouldn't even have the America we have if it hadn't been for slavery. And, the kind of things that I was taught a very one-sided story about the history of our country. And I learned so many interesting things about, I guess, what would have been to me the other side of history. But now I realize it's really our history, and how I have to embrace that and come to terms with it.
John, you have anything to add?
No, I'd say that those are two really good points. And just to add a little bit onto what Laura was saying, I think we've learned collectively a lot in these past few months that racism, of course, is not just actions, right? It can be unconscious bias, it could be silence, and it certainly is systemic. So I think that is kind of the evolution of the conversation around racism and the road that it's taken in these past couple months.
Yeah, y'all kind of mentioned silence, the not saying something when our Black friends aren't around, letting a joke or a racist comment slide, right? Your grandpa, grandma, so, they're old. I'm not going to be able to get through to them. Let them be. But that's not right. That's just contributing to the problem.
Yeah,
as far as I see it anyway.
I agree with you 100%. And I think that there's a lot more people now who are open to and willing to have these conversations than there was in the past. Frankly, I've spoke with people who I never expected to have such an open mind around these conversations of race. But if you really do want to be an ally, right, you do have to listen and learn. That is a huge part of it. And as an ally, if we're being told that being silent in instances of racial injustice or any injustice is being complicit, then we need to listen to that and we should take action on it. I really think it's that easy, right, on that one.
Right.
Well, I was raised that discussing political issues or difficult issues about race was impolite. I was taught that we don't discuss that kind of thing, and it's not that it's impolite. It's difficult, and it's easy for me as a white person to ignore. Being able to have the privilege to say, oh, I don't care about politics, or I don't really, you have to have a lot of privilege to be able to say that, because it means that you are not being directly affected by prejudice or racist policies or anything like that. And so we can bring it up to the people who are saying it. They may not want to hear it. I have family members who don't want to hear it, but there are other people listening. There are other people watching. You may not be able to have a tough conversation with certain people, but other people are watching and listening, and you should always be able to speak up and call those kinds of things out.
I think one of the things that has really struck me, and I'd never really thought about this before, is that this has to become a white person's issue if we want things to change, because we are in the majority. We are holding the majority of positions of power, and in the positions where laws are being passed, and you look at the majority of police officers, they're white. Majority of business owners and CEOs are white. So the majority of decisions in our entire culture are being made by white people, and until we decide that this is a problem that we all need to get involved in and solve, I don't think it's going to be solved. So I know I'm really committed at this point. The more I've read, the more overwhelmed I am by how big this issue is and how many people we really need to get involved in making the needed changes in order to push the needle at all.
Yeah, we talked a little bit ahead. Sorry, go ahead, Amy.
You haven't talked. Go ahead. I
don't need to talk.
Well,
people hear me talk all the time.
I was thinking about how it is our job, as if you are, as many of us are, people in a position of power and privilege to help push those changes. But a lot of it, we need to remember that we need to include people of color in those decisions. We don't just want to make decisions for people and say, oh, we should have so many Black people on a board of directors, or go find a person who you trust of color, and then get them on the board if they're interested, and then say, what do you want to see? Like, you want to hear their point of view too. You don't just want to speak for them and say, oh, we need you to be on our board and there we fixed it. Like, no, we don't have the right to speak for their feelings and their experiences, but we do need to say, here's someone whose voice needs to be heard. How do we include them? And then ask and listen.
Yeah.
And so it does need to be a white person's issue. And I'm looking at some of the comments on Facebook right now. And as Amber Sellers points out, it has to be a white person's issue, but white people can't lead the change, right? We can't lead it. And as you were mentioning, bringing in a person of color, a black person, a black friend to come in and then ask the question, what change do you see happening here? And then follow that lead.
Yeah,
right.
Otherwise it's, I mean, you can't, or they'll, or say, what do you see as a problem we haven't addressed? What do you see as something that would help you feel more included and welcomed and valued and respected? And how do we make that happen?
Because I feel like it would just be more white privilege to come in and take over a cause.
Right. And I meant more of, we have to become the advocates. I mean, we have to, because I mean, again, we're the majority. So if everybody continues to sit on the sidelines who are white because of our white privilege, and well, it doesn't affect us, I'm not afraid of the police. I am given the benefit of the doubt wherever I go that I belong, right? I mean, I feel like I've got a sort of an all access pass to wherever I want to go, whenever I want to go, without fear. That is not something people of color deal with. And so, obviously we need to be educated on the issues and we need to understand where they would like to see our efforts, but we're going to have to be advocates all together in order to make the systemic changes that need to be changed.
I definitely agree with that. And I think it's also just as important to realize when you or I or all of us as white people, the times that we're not the right messenger, right? So it's just as important to know when to use your voice, but then also to realize that you might not be the best voice all the time. And a recent example I can think of, I've been doing voter registration drives at a lot of Black Lives rallies, Black Lives Matter rallies across the state. And recently at one, I was approached by a local news reporter who was asking me about the movement and why I was there. And it kind of just caught me off guard because I was like, why are you asking me this? Because I'm like the white kid at the voter reg table. You should be asking the people who actually organized this and led this movement. I'm really not the one who should be doing this interview, And I think that it's important for us as white people to realize those moments when Black people should be the ones leading and speaking on those issues.
Yeah, totally agree.
It reminds me because we were talking a little bit before this, and we're all reading, right? We're all educating. I'm currently in White Fragility.
Great book.
And Robin DiAngelo likens this, what we're talking about right now, having white allies, to women's suffrage, right? So identity politics. So women did not have the power to vote.
Right.
So they could not change that with their vote.
Exactly.
Right. So the white men had to be the ones to change that for them. But here, we're not necessarily changing something. This is kind of what I'm learning, or I guess a question I'm asking. We're not necessarily change something for our Black friends, for people of color, but we're making the way for them to change it.
We're changing it together, changing it.
Right. It's going to take all of us. Amy, you mentioned something about, what we were taught growing up, and my later elementary and junior high and high school years were spent in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And we never heard about the massacre, the Tulsa massacre.
Even in
never
Tulsa.
heard of it. I heard about it for the first time when we were just talking about it, like a month ago.
I learned about it last year because I'm a comic book fan, and I was watching Watchmen on HBO, and the opening, the pilot episode starts with a recreation, and it's brutal. And I thought, this is horrific. And then I was like, wait, is this real? And I looked it up, and I was horrified to discover that it was real and that I knew nothing about it.
Well, I found that very interesting, and it goes back to the white privilege that we're talking about, because most of us live in a very segregated, community, and the schools I've gone to have been primarily white, and the communities are primarily white, employment primarily white. I've honestly had very little culture. I don't know the best word, but I have not lived an integrated life with people of color. So I have not heard a lot about their struggles and about their stories. And, I've been living in my own little world. And I've attended a couple of protests, and I've listened to the personal stories that people of color are sharing about the injustice that they've incurred through encounters with the police or whatever it might be. And it has just occurred to me how little we really know about what's going on. And one of the things that has floored me more than anything, I've been reading the book, The New Jim Crow. And, it's basically a history book on the war on drugs, which was started by the Reagan administration, and how that has unfairly targeted people of color, and has led to the mass incarceration, which has caused all kinds of systemic issues for the communities. But I remember as a kid, sitting in front of the TV and watching President Reagan give that address on war on drugs, and thinking, wow, this is great. This is good. This is good stuff, right? Having no clue that this was all really just dog whistle for, way to put people of color in jail and label them as felons, which then make them second-class citizens for the rest of their life. Had no idea that all of these laws were being passed at the federal level without really any of us being aware of it. All of it was done behind the scenes, under the veil of being tough on crime or war on drugs. And we were clueless. At least I know I was. I was totally clueless. And most of the people that, I'm talking to about, racism and the systemic issues, none of us were aware that these laws had been passed, or that there were mandatory minimum jail sentences now for, first-time possession, and, just a lot of really horrific statistics in that book. So, wow, it has been very eye-opening and very overwhelming, truly.
That's not, my experience is different than that. I've been living in Missouri for about 15 years, but I grew up in Colorado. But I've been to every state. I was a flight attendant for a number of years. I've had all these crazy jobs. I've traveled all over. I've lived in a bunch of states. I have a pretty wide experience, but so none of those things are really surprising to me. But at the same time, I'm still learning, even though I knew all that stuff that you're saying you just learned, not everything, but I've known all about the injustice within our justice system. I've known about the war on drugs being a kind of cover for jailing Black men. I still have a lot of things that I don't know. I still have a lot of things that I get wrong. I still have a lot of things, times where I put my foot in it and I'm not being the best advocate I could be. And I feel like that's one of the biggest things I'm working on now in these last few months, is to be like, okay, you're right, I didn't know, or thanks, now I've learned, or thank you for correcting me, I guess I didn't know the whole story. Being able to admit that I didn't know. Even though I've been an activist since my teens, even though I've, done all these things, there's a lot that I am not going to get right. And I think it's important that we all give each other a little room for that too.
Amy, I think you're super right. And I'm glad that you brought up Watchmen earlier, because I think that you are not the only person who found out about the Tulsa Massacre because of that TV show. And honestly, how embarrassing is it that we have to learn about the history that happened in our own country from a TV show about comic books?
Seriously.
That's frankly embarrassing that that's how I learned about that.
Yep.
I think it's even deeper than that, right? Like I grew up in South Florida. I grew up in the South in a southern state. When I was taught about the Civil War in school, in high school and middle school, I was taught that it was a war for states' rights, right? I wasn't taught that this was a war to protect slavery. I was taught that it was a war to protect states' rights.
Wow.
And of course, that is a horrific mischaracterization of what the Civil War was and what that states' right was for. But it really just goes to show how the levels of our education system, all the way back to how we grew up and what we were taught, it's just in a lot of ways inaccurate,
It's pathetic that we have to relearn our history. It is sad that we have to now, as adults, relearn the true history of our country when it should have been taught to us in the first place, right? But we had no idea. Not an excuse per se, but we had no idea. Now that we know, like all of us, at least all of us here, we're searching out answers, right? We're trying to educate ourselves. But I've never lived that life. I'm like you, I'm privileged because of the color of my skin. So I've never been in a Black person's shoes or a person of color's shoes to understand that. And I think over the last month, couple months, I've started to at least, appreciation's probably the wrong word. And Amy, I stick my foot in my mouth all the time. So yeah, all the time. So I am thankful for the grace that people give me. But I think the appreciation of what people went through and why this has to stop. Right?
Yeah, and understanding of other people's stories, other people's realities. I mean, one of the things when I first learned about white privilege, and I'd never heard that word until I took a class at UMKC from my first Black teacher. This was my second go around in college, and it got all that way until I had my first Black teacher, Carolyn Thompson, and she had us read the knapsack of invisible privilege. And there was one of the things in there was talking about how I don't have to raise my child to be aware of the dangers that are out there for them when it comes to police and other people and crime. And, just that was the one that really got me, where I was like, I don't have to raise my children to understand the dangers they could be in just because of the colors of their skin. And that's when I realized that my privilege was going to be a long, hard, heavy thing for me to understand and something to overcome when I was raising my own children, to try and teach them how to be, now we are saying anti-racist, because that's the active kind of term. And that the word racist is not it's not like a curse word. It's not a death knell. It's something that we can be in one moment, but not in another. It's something that, if your attitude towards one thing is maybe inclusive and comprehensive, great, but in another, maybe not. So you might have a little bit of a racist thought here. So it's important to realize that, that label, understanding your privilege and feeling afraid that maybe, oh my gosh, maybe I'm a racist, maybe I did a racist thing. Like, it's not a forever label. It's not a forever thing that will sit on you and crown you forever and ruin you. It is something that you can say, okay, what am I missing? What am I afraid of? What am I not seeing? What experience am I needing to understand from someone else's point of view? I don't know, that I'm kind of rambling on that thought, but we have to embrace the fact that we've made these mistakes too.
Laura, when did you own your white privilege?
Oh gosh, I think I'm just now owning it. Honestly, I'm just now owning it. It's been over the last couple of months because I'd never thought about it. It wasn't an issue that I had thought about.
And that's
And that
privilege right
is
there.
white privilege, right?
Yeah.
There, right?
Exactly.
Never having to think about it. Obviously, it's just something that, you know, I was born with. I won the lottery. You know, I was born with white skin, and so I've never had to think about it. In the new Jim Crow book, I wanted to just throw something out that it stated in here, because I was just like, oh my gosh, this says so much in a paragraph. But it goes to white privilege. So if you will bear with me for just a minute, I want to read this. It says, can we envision a system that would enforce drug laws almost exclusively among young white men and largely ignore drug crime among young Black men? Can we imagine large majorities of young white men being rounded up for minor drug offenses, placed under the control of the criminal justice system, labeled felons, and then subjected to a lifetime of discrimination, scorn, and exclusion? Can we imagine this happening while most Black men landed decent jobs or trotted off to college? No, we cannot. It would, the criminalization of white men would disturb us to the core. And as I read that, I thought, you know, they're absolutely right. Why have we become so numb to this issue as it's just mainstream and it's accepted? Why have we just accepted that this is okay?
Because it benefits us. Because it benefits us. We have nothing to lose by ignoring it. I mean, that's what's so frightening about privilege, is that you don't have to even be aware you have it, and yet it's there.
Right. What
So
motivates us to change it if we're not affected by it?
Right.
And right now, I mean, it's just I guess the compassion, you know, that we're feeling, and the being awakened and going, oh my gosh, you know, all this is happening, and how did I truly not know this was happening? Or you know, I was involved in local government for 21 years, you know, in a white privileged community, in a white privileged local government with a police department that does community policing in a very, you know, polite, respectful way. And honestly, I just was not personally involved with these issues. And so it's just very easy, because it didn't affect me.
Mm-hmm.
It's just very easy to just, you know, you get sidetracked into all the other things that obviously, you know, come to you, your children in school, and, you know, all that kind of stuff. You just get mired in all of those details instead of reaching out and looking for, you know, what's happening outside of your own little world.
And that's why I think saying Black Lives Matter means so much, is because you're acknowledging, you know, here is a group of people who have been enslaved for 250 years, discriminated against through Jim Crow laws, and you know, for another 50. It's not as if we've even been in a place of technical equality for long enough that this can be looked past. I mean, we can live our lives without realizing it's there, but to go back and really see how long this has been affecting Black lives, how long Black lives have been marginalized and systematically pigeonholed, you know, it's hard to ignore if you care about any kind of injustice.
Definitely. And I will say too, that I feel like there is a bit of a generational gap there, because I can remember growing up in high school and college and being well aware of white privilege and that it existed, and kind of feeling like when I talked about that stuff to older white people, like I was talking to a wall, right? Like they just didn't. It was like I was speaking a different language. But now, you know, fast forward just 5-6 years later, those same people who were so unreceptive are now suddenly like, oh yeah, maybe I should challenge my own pre-existing thoughts, and maybe I should have some of these hard and tough conversations, because I mean, truly, and like Amber said in the comments here, it's not about white people's feelings and how we feel about this, right?
Yeah.
It's about those hard conversations and those challenging conversations, and we talk about here, right, in our home backyards, right, Johnson County. That didn't happen by mistake, right? We can go all the way back to J.C. Nichols.
Oh, yeah.
Reasons why Johnson County is set up the way it is, right? And it was largely to keep out the Black community, and in large parts the Jewish community. And we can look up those deed restrictions and the HOAs that exist in large amounts of Johnson County and are still on the books today.
Yeah.
And right, that didn't happen by accident. There is a reason why Johnson County looks like the way it does.
Yeah. Even my HOA, and I'm on the Missouri side and I live in Brookside, but the HOA that I was a part of had not as many exclusions. We weren't a J.C. Nichols founded neighborhood. So a lot of immigrants who were excluded from his neighborhood building, codes, and just the redlining. We didn't see that as much in my neighborhood, but it was still up into the 2000s in the technical code for our neighborhood about no African Americans. I mean, we had to write it out once it was discovered. And that was horrifying that it was still there.
Really sad how many places it still exists.
Right. It still exists in Prairie Village. I know there are several homes associations who are now talking about it. Yeah.
We're getting rid of it in Roland Park.
Good.
Well,
Good.
yeah.
Good.
But who knew they were on the
things
books?
we can do.
That's the things that we have to, those are the things we can do. That's what we have to look at. Like we've been talking, it's so systemic. That's how systemic it is. Like it's with the founding of cities, of neighborhoods, that racism is ingrained there. So what's one thing we can all do? We could look at our city code, right? We can look at different neighborhood or homeowners associations. We can get those taken off the books like a lot of people are doing. That's one thing. So I think we know what we understand, or we're coming to an understanding, or we're learning. And I'm talking about us here, not the general we, but us here. What racism is, what systemic racism is. We've all had an experience with overcoming our own problems, if you will, with accepting and owning the term white privilege. We understand it, but what can we do? What are we doing right now? I'm reading a book, which is good, right? Is our learning, do you think our learning curve is over though? Like, is it learning curve is over? Not that this is the end of the conversation, but hey, we've had time to learn. What's the action that we're taking?
I mean, reading the books is a good place to start. There's documentaries. You could be a part of conversations like the one we're having. You can take a class, but you also need to do something. You can't just say, I read the book, now I'm an anti-racist. It doesn't really work that way. You want to hold government leadership accountable, hold your family accountable, hold people on boards that you're a part of accountable, explaining, reaching out and trying to include voices of color in any of the work that you're doing. I do a lot of work for Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America, and it's a lot of white moms. And we had to work hard to include women of color from Kansas City who are traumatically affected by gun violence all the time. We had to work to include them in our organization. And so we would go to their organizations. We went to Mothers in Charge, Casey Mothers in Charge, and we went to their meetings. We stood on corners with them. We listened to them, and then we said, what can we do to help you? Oh, okay, you have a group who provides stuff for children whose parents die of gun violence. Okay, we will help you with your Christmas gifts for these kids. And you know what I mean? Like anything that you can do, I mean, you really have to get out there and in the community and do it. And to me, that's been some of the more rewarding stuff and the things where I've learned more about where I live and what power I have, what I can do.
I think, if you're talking about how mainstream can help as well, education. I mean, this conversation that we're having right now is because we're all getting educated. We're reading these books that are making our minds go, wow, there's so much here and so much that, needs to be done. Education, I think is a huge part, because I see, posts on Facebook from friends, from colleagues that I'm like, oh my gosh, that's such an uneducated statement. I don't think you really get it. the people who are like, well, all lives matter, or the white guy my age who says, prove to me I have white privilege. Those kinds of comments, I'm like, oh my gosh, we have so much education to do. So I think really educating people, helping to educate is a key. I think it's helping to educate those who are in positions of power, to help them understand the issues that maybe they don't understand. I don't think we should assume that everybody understands. I mean, again, when I was mayor, I certainly didn't understand all these issues. So, maybe it's getting books in people's hands. Maybe it's bringing them to some of the protests and the rallies where you're hearing individuals, give their impassioned stories about, their personal stories. That has really affected me, is to, hear from people who have been directly affected, their families have been directly affected. And, if you're a compassionate person, it's really hard to walk away from that unaffected. So I think it's education. Michael and I've talked a little bit about, in terms of educating the public, when we talk about pulling together the candidates and, the recommendations for who we think people should vote for. I don't recall in the past that we ever asked any of these questions, anything with regard to the judicial system, or, drug laws, or racial bias, or anything like that. So, I think starting to ask people who are running for office how they feel about these issues is important, and letting them know that we do care about these things. I think it's understanding that judges and prosecutors are also elected, and yet we have no idea, right, where they stand on these issues. So somehow trying to get more information on them and getting that information out to voters, getting people to vote. I think a lot of, the good work that you guys are already doing and getting more voters to the polls, whether they're people of color or they're younger people or whatever, I think is just hugely important. But I mean, there's a lot of work that we need to do in the legal justice system, like a lot.
Yes.
Well, and I'm glad you brought up voting, because I think that's where I can make the most difference. I think that's one of my on my top 2 things to do to make a difference. And it's voting in the right candidates. It's getting voter education out there. It's engaging voters, first-time voters, non-voters, low propensity or infrequent voters. And the one person on this panel here that knows the most about that is the guy that's been doing it for the last over the last year. And so, John, I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about the work in those communities that you're doing, that Voter to Voter and the Voter Network is doing, and how can people find out information about candidates?
Definitely, and thank you for the question. So Voter to Voter, we're a voter turnout project, and our specific focus is reaching out the rising American electorate, which is defined by people of color, young people, and single women. So we have a real drive to focus on those voters, because traditionally speaking, those groups have voted at more infrequent rates than white people. So that's kind of our project, and that's our real focus, and we're really trying to reach those communities, and we've been going around the state and doing that. But kind of building off what Mayor Wassmer said, and she'll probably love this because I can't agree with her more, change really, when we're talking about police departments too in the justice system, it really comes from municipal level elections, right? So your city council, your mayor runs your police department, right? Your DA is a local election. Unfortunately, on average in Kansas, usually only about 15 to 20% of people even bother to vote for city council races at municipal elections. In 2009,
I mean, really, that's high for city council.
Brutal.
Yeah.
And it's unbelievable this year too, because we have so many great DA's races that are currently happening right now, right? Like, so in Wyco, we have a DA's race going on. In Johnson County, there's a DA's race going on. And these are incredibly important races, but unfortunately,
they get no coverage.
People vote. Yeah. And I will say, I saw a question in the comments about, and I saw a question in the comments about how to learn more about who these candidates are. I remember Mayor Wassmer, you were saying it's really tough to find information on some of the DA candidates. And the judges, right? Not so much info out there on them. We did launch ksballot.org. So I'll say that one more time. It's ksballot.org. It's a ballot lookup website where you can actually see what candidates are on your ballot. And beside that, it actually links out right to their website and their social media. So it's kind of one-stop shopping. If you want to find out some information about some of these smaller races, they don't have as much money to get their name out there. So that's a good way to learn about those candidates and what they stand for.
You can make a plan to vote there. You can print out or print out your ballot guide, find your polling locations, your early voting dates, early voting in-person locations. So there's a wealth of information at ksballot.org for the voter, for all voters, but especially the voter that may not know exactly what's on their ballot, right?
And
So thanks for mentioning that.
I'll share that kind of thing on social media. I have a pretty big social media reach on Facebook and starting to be on Twitter, where I get a lot of my posts shared just because I'm vocal and kind of a loudmouth. And so people are like, I'll share this. That's easier than saying it myself. But I will share that kind of information about voting's coming up. Look up your ballot here. I won't say necessarily who you should vote for unless I have super strong feelings about it. But you can say, go find your ballot, see who's there. Here are the candidates. Look up, like the Kansas City Star usually does a thing about candidates and what they stand for, and yes and no, or why you might like them, why you might not. I kind of try to share those things in my social media. I think voting is super huge, and people don't realize how much it affects the systematic, the systematic racist policies that we have, and how those are the people that can undo a lot of that stuff, that can rework it, that can rewrite it, that can change the laws and the rules that we're living under.
100%.
If governing bodies don't represent or don't look like the constituents or the people they represent, then people are getting left out of the decision-making process. And those people that are getting left out are 99% of the time the most affected by those decisions.
Exactly.
That was something else that I was going to mention, is us being champions for people of color running for office.
Yes.
How can we help find them, mentor them, get them involved so that we can change, some of the diversity, increase the diversity in our elected mix?
Well, right. I mean, how can we just, not all of us, but Laura, you and I, like you mentioned, came from a pretty segregated childhood experience growing up. How do we reach out to people? And I think a ton of groups have popped up, even in just the last couple of months, advocacy organizations that we can all reach out to. And if that's not already there, put the bug in their head about getting people to run for office.
Right.
That's how we're going to change. That's how we're going to change things.
Hugely important. I remember I was reading this recent study that was talking about having Black people in places of leadership, but it also talked about police departments and how the police departments that have the lowest rates of police brutality against Black people are also the departments that have more Black police officers. And who would have thought that if we had a more diverse police force, perhaps they would be better about policing, So it's some of these answers, like, why have we not been doing this all along? And it's important to remember that we're not immune to it, right? Right in our own backyard in Johnson County, we have some systems in place that are deeply flawed. Think about it. Just in Overland Park, we had an officer shoot and kill a kid recently. And that officer got a $70,000 severance payment after the killing, was not charged by the DA. And this is right here in Johnson County, right? So we have the OISIT, which I don't know if you guys have heard about this. I actually just learned about this. Every time there is a officer involved shooting in Johnson County, it is investigated by the officer involved shooting investigation team, which sounds great, right? Like this independent panel of people who can investigate cops. The problem with that is that panel is composed of cops. So oftentimes they will rule in favor of other cops. So it's systems like that exist in our own backyards that frankly make no sense and receive national news. It's been in the Washington Post, this story. Yep. And it just slides on and on year after year. So drawing attention to things like that and electing people who can actually change those systems, hugely important.
Mm-hmm.
There's a question in Oh, go ahead, Amy, and then I'd like to, go ahead, please. And I'd like
I
to
was
address
just
the
thinking
question.
there are other things you can do that seem small, but that they make a difference. And that's something like supporting Black-owned businesses. There's lots of lists going around now for Kansas City, for other places. You can find Black-owned restaurants, you can find Black-owned bookstores, you can support these people with your money. I think that maybe it doesn't seem like you're doing a lot if you just buy a dinner or if you buy a book, but if you tell other people, hey, this is a cool bookstore, hey, I had this great meal, that helps lift up and kind of bring, more, it just brings people, it lifts them up and brings them into our communities. And if our communities have been, negligent and inclusive and not as inclusive, you can work to do small things like that.
Well, and that's actually a perfect lead into the question from the chat. So thank you very much for mentioning that. It is something little, but it has a huge impact. So the question that we have coming in is, how come it's difficult for most white people to admit that sharing power and wealth is also what is needed to impact systemic racism? Simple answer, because white people benefit from it.
Yeah.
From it.
And they feel like, and I think a lot of
Right.
white people feel like they're going to be losing something, but it's not pie where there's some for you and there's some for everyone. There's enough for everyone. I mean, a lot of people are very greedy and very afraid to let go, or don't want to be taxed when they make more money, don't want to hire, they don't want the regular tax rate. They want a lower tax rate to keep everything. But I mean, I think you have to, I don't know, the money inequalities. Like if we think that, Black Lives Matter and looking at systematic racism is our issue now, the next big issue is going to be financial. It's going to be the haves and the have-nots, and it's going to be money and who has it and who doesn't. And it's plain that the people who have the most of it want to remain in power and will do anything they can to keep it. I don't know. I think that people are afraid of losing their status, of losing their power. But equality doesn't demand that you lose that power or lose that money. It just means that you make sure other people have the same opportunities that you've had. You make sure that people can come up. I don't know. It's hard, but I know that people deny it or are afraid of doing that because they're afraid of losing their own stuff.
Well, and some of those people, frankly, need to lose power. Bottom line, some of those people need to lose power, and we need to give that power to people who are going to use it for good. Yeah. Right, and not just their own self-interest.
And then how do we do that? How do we
voting?
Yes, right.
We vote, and so then how do we? I'm not yelling at you. Sorry, I just got a little passionate there. We do it by voting, and we do it by getting other people to vote, and we do it by being advocates for change. We had a question come in to that. Are there concrete ways? Now we're getting into concrete ways that we can help as allies with voting. So voting in underserved areas, or assisting with transportation, or ways that we can help community organizations.
So I will say that transportation to and from the polls, I know that's like a popular thing that people want to do and they think is a large help, but oftentimes you'll find that more cars show up than voters to get into those cars. And then secondly, this year, of course, it's a pandemic, right? So I would say the biggest thing that we can really do to encourage voting and voter turnout, some concrete ways that you can actually do that is one, is encourage people to vote by mail. Studies show that voter turnout is higher when people vote by mail. And not only is it better for voter turnout, it's also frankly safer during the middle of a pandemic, right? It makes sense. Secondly, like I was saying before, the Voter Network, our main goal is reaching out to communities that have been left behind traditionally by the political process, right? And one of those communities includes people of color. And so one of the ways that we work, we're a relational turnout organization, which really means just talking to your friends about voting. So that, again, if you want to check it out, it's thevoternetwork.org. It's a really concrete way that you can get involved and make actual steps to drive up voter turnout across Kansas and the communities that need it the most.
I do know that in Missouri, I think unless you are above, I think if you're over 65, you do not need mail-in voting to be authorized. But if you are under, that age, I'm pretty sure you have to have mail-in voting notarized, not authorized, sorry, notarized. So you need, so I know a lot of people are applying to become notaries because they see the need for that in this upcoming election on the Missouri side. I don't know what it's like on the Kansas side.
Like Kansas, you don't need that.
Okay,
You don't need that.
so that's, finding a notary is not exactly easy for a lot of people. So I know that there are notaries who are traveling to people. There are notary events. You could become a notary, you know, it's just like a small class. It's like a day thing and bam, you get your stamp and then you're a notary. So, you know, you could become a notary if you felt like you wanted to help with mail-in voting in Missouri. Just an idea.
And as John mentioned, in Kansas, we have no excuse, absentee, right? Which you think for Kansas, it'd be, you know, it'd be opposite, that we would have more restrictive voting laws, but anyone in Kansas can request a mail ballot for any reason, right? We have to do it for both elections.
Yeah, and I'm really optimistic too about the numbers that we've seen in Kansas. So just yesterday, we started mailing out ballots in Kansas. But the last number I saw, I believe we were up to 230,000 requests for vote by mail ballots.
Wow.
To put that in comparison, 2016 by this time, there was only 30,000 requests. So we are talking about huge amounts of people this year who are going to be voting by mail. And I think next steps too are also keeping in mind that election offices need to start preparing to get ready for that huge swell in the number of ballots they're going to have to count this year. And I think the state should be doing everything possible to prepare election offices and be encouraging people to vote by mail and make sure that we're ready for it in November so we can avoid a election slip up.
And that's Secretary of State, which is also an elected position.
Yes, yes.
Laura, why do you think, and this is a little bit off the voting topic, but why do you think, because you've been quiet up there, we haven't let you talk, that women,
much in the beginning.
no, because we just kept jumping in. Why do you think that allyship is mostly right now, the heavy lifting is being done by women and not white men?
Oh, wow, that's a good one.
That wasn't mine. I can't take credit for it. It came from the chat.
That's so interesting because that is not news to me. I have thought about that quite a bit, that I'm seeing women carry the load, whether it's in the Black communities or in a lot of political arenas right now. And I think, you know, I don't know if it has to do with the fact that we're mothers. Many of us are mothers. And, you know, there's something about motherhood that I think tends to make you a lot less selfish and caring about other human beings and developing others. And I know in hearing the stories from Black mothers about, you know, losing their sons in these horrific ways and seeing the videos, I mean, as a mom, you cannot not be impacted by that. So I don't know if it's the mothering or the compassion, you know, that I think comes fairly naturally to women. But I think it's also, it hasn't been that long since women were in a second class as well, you know, and we're still not equal. We're getting closer, but, you know, I think we can relate to that. I think many of us have been in positions where we have felt that, you know, we may not have had the same access as maybe a male. I remember my first job out of college, it was between me and a guy to go work for a construction company, and they chose the guy, you know. Now I ended up in a better position with Hallmark. You know, I would have enjoyed Hallmark more than the construction company, but still, we were very equally qualified, and they chose the guy. So, you know, I've experienced discrimination, so I understand it, I think. And I think a lot of women have been in situations where maybe they get it.
Yeah, I agree. Women have been reaching and stretching for equality for a long, long time. And I mean, prior to BLM kind of taking over the nation and the world, there was Me Too. And every woman was like, hey, Me Too. We all know, we've all experienced, you know, some sort of way in which we've been pigeonholed or taken advantage of. I mean, I really think that's all women. You know, maybe it's not all women, but I really think it is. And so we have Yeah,
Yeah.
we have an affinity for this already.
I see a lot of younger men. I mean, if I had to say that there were some men that are taking up the cause, they would be younger men that are taking up the cause rather than like the middle-aged men or the older men.
True.
Yep.
Question came in. Oh, go ahead, Laura.
No, I was just going to say, you know, again, we were touching on people who don't want to lose what they have. You know, typically the white male in our society has been the one who's had the majority of power and wealth. So in their mind, they have the most to lose. And, you know, like Amy was saying, I don't think it's an either or, but in their mind, I think they're thinking, well, you know, if you used to be a white guy, you got any job you wanted. And now you have to compete for those jobs with women, people of color, you know. So I can see how, you know, a generation of men who grew up without any competition are now feeling threatened by having people who didn't used to compete with them in the ring competing. So I'm sure there is a sense of loss and control and power that they don't want to lose.
So every time I have another discussion, I found out or I realize just how freaking easy my life has been because of my gender and the color of my skin. Like just how many things I have not had to go through. And I think to your point, Laura, a lot of older white men, a lot of white guys, they go into this white protection program, right? Where like it's really easy. I mean, but for real, like it's really easy for white people, especially white guys, to kind of go in and hide from the rest of the world with, you know, with their whiteness, and then get comforted, feel okay about it, right? Because they're maintaining their status, basically.
And I think it's what you grew up with, right? I mean, when you talk about most of this seems to be more of a older white man issue versus a younger white man issue. Well, the younger white men have been raised with women working side by side with them, right? Their mothers were working. You know, when I was little, mothers stayed home. And now, you know, when you were little, your mothers were working. So it's a very different world for the younger generation. I mean, to have women as equal and women involved and women working, and now LGBTQ, you know, is coming in, and it's just more of what's normal, and this is how we are. But that's a very different world than what people age 65 and older experienced.
We have a question that came in on topic, and it's the real question is if one can recognize male privilege so easily, why does it take some white women so long to recognize their white privilege?
Oh, that's a good one.
I know, right? But I think everyone has to come into it. Like, it's not just something that you recognize, right? Like, I had to get over the hump of privilege and understand that I really had it. But do white women, does it take them longer in your experience?
There are a lot of white women who benefit from a white male patriarch society. There are a lot of women who can't break out of that. Breaking out of that kind of society or that pattern would require women to, I'm thinking about like rural women, like in Iowa. I went to college in Iowa, and we were trying to add the words "and women" to the Constitution, and all these for sorority girls were like, it's sexist and my place is behind my man. And, you know, and I thought these girls are insane, but also their whole structure and way of life was dependent on being subservient and standing behind, and it was tied to a religious thing. And so, you know, even if you come to terms with realizing that men have the power, like women are still kind of tied into those systems that men have created. And so it's harder to get out from under that and say, wow, not only should I have my own power, but also these other people, these people of color, these marginalized people, we need to help them too, because they see that they themselves may become endangered if they A, step away from the system that they're a part of, and then B, try to bring something even more foreign into it. You know, I don't know. I think there are a lot of women who are extra afraid to do it, but once they do it, it's easy to be vocal. Once you cross that hump, it's easy, but getting there is not so easy for a lot of women.
Yeah, I agree. I think a lot of women get their power through their husband's power, right? Especially, you know, I'm going to say my age and older. You know, a lot of women may not have worked. And so they got their social status, their financial status through their husband. So they may not realize their white privilege at all.
Yeah, because first they would have to acknowledge the male privilege and then recognize that, okay, I don't know. It's a very tough thing to come out from under for many, many people.
We even had to develop a word for this type of person, and it's called a Karen.
Yeah.
Right.
Truly.
Very true, John.
It's true. It's true.
Yeah.
I think if everyone's okay, we have time for a little more chat, maybe one more question. And it's something I didn't know. Someone asked, why did we change Black History Month to Be Kind Month or Kindness Month? I lost it in the chat here. Be Kind Month. I haven't heard that. Had anyone else heard that?
Nope, had not heard that.
I didn't know that either. Again, see, something I can look into, something I can educate myself about. I don't know what that is. I'll look into it. But I mean, I'm thinking about like, okay, I'm an Italian American, and a lot of us were raised to believe in Christopher Columbus as a hero. He means nothing to me personally, so I'm okay to watch that statue go down. But like, do I want to work hard to replace it with Juneteenth? Sure, why not? You know what I mean? Like, there are some things like that maybe I don't know much about that I want to learn more about, that I can be more of an advocate for. So whatever the thing is with the Kindness Month, I need to look into that more.
Can we talk about statues? I really want to talk about statues with some other people.
Okay.
I really do. So I'll ask the question. So what do you think about this? And I think we're all going to be on the same page. What do you think about tearing down these Confederate statues, taking them down?
They all went up for the most part after slavery was abolished, and then during the Equality Acts in the 60s. And it was as a reminder to put people in their place. They didn't go up because we revered these people. They went up to keep the status quo. And so I have no problem with them coming down at all. I also think that America was built on tearing down statues. When the Declaration of Independence was first read in New York City, everyone went to a statue of King George and took it down, melted it into bullets. I mean, these are things we have done as Americans. I mean, the idea of protest being patriotic. And yes, I think that, a statue coming down in a violent way, it's certainly not ideal, but I also think that, like, who is it really hurting? This isn't erasing history. This is changing our idols. This is kill your idols. This is punk rock. This is, I think it's fine. Like, I don't see anything wrong with it. Human beings are more important than statues. And I mean, heck, even Jesus overturned the tables in the, there's a little bit of shake it up stuff that has to happen every now and then. And I think that's okay.
Speaking of Jesus, you know who didn't like statues? Jesus, right? Like the Bible has a whole section about not having false worship.
Yeah.
So people, funny, like for a large part, I feel like most of these people who get so mad about these statues coming down, in the next sentence, they're also, claiming they're good evangelical Christians. And I'm like, oh, that's a little bit weird, but okay.
I have no problem with the statues coming down. I just hope that people don't say, see, we've ended racism because the statues are down. You know, I mean, we have so much more work to do that I hate to see energy being put towards statues instead of changing the systems that are still holding the racial hierarchy in its place.
So, and I agree. I think the statues should come down and come down quickly. I don't know what we should do with them. Like, so they turned Auschwitz. They turned Auschwitz into a museum, right?
Yeah.
And it's somewhere that you go and you can see the tragedy that happened. People keep talking about don't erase history. Well, that horrible stuff that happened is part of our history. So we're not going to forget it. I don't think the statues should be destroyed. I think that they should not. I don't think they should be memorialized, but I think they should be put somewhere so that people see what happened, see what was done to people of color throughout the years, so that we do not repeat our history.
Like, who is this person? Why Andrew Jackson? Why did everyone want that to come down? Like, learn more about why.
And well, teach about him, the real him, in history.
And I don't know about you guys, but like, I don't think I've ever learned anything from a statue. Like, I've learned from books, from museums. I've never like approached a statue and just been like, wow, I just learned so much about this. Statues aren't put up to learn history. They're put up to idolize people, right?
And they weren't put up to teach people either. They really were put up in times of turmoil to kind of say, look, we think this should still be the status quo, even though you're all getting rights and you're getting voting rights. And, you know, that they were put up as a reminder of who is in power and as a reminder of white privilege and as a reminder of systematic racism.
I think
so. You think they should be destroyed, John?
I don't know that they need to be destroyed. I mean, it's not like we're going to turn them into bullets like they did with that King George statue, but I think that you know, they could go into a museum. I don't know. I mean, there's part of me as an art teacher that thinks, gosh, you don't need to destroy a statue, do you? But at the same time, I think that we are creating new history right now by tearing them down, by wanting them to go away, by saying we don't revere this anymore. That's not erasing history. That's creating a new history. That's creating a new norm. That's creating a new societal viewpoint. So you could put it in a museum and say, here's when things changed, here's why they changed, here's why people were so upset, and here's how it went down.
I also think that we should definitely include input from the communities of people who are marginalized and offended by these statues, right?
Absolutely.
So if us putting them into a museum is still offensive and we're not getting that message and we're not hearing from it, that's not good either, right? So we need people of color who have been traditionally marginalized and find these statues offensive to tell us what's the best approach as well and what they think would be a good remedy. And I think Mayor Wasmer touched on this briefly earlier when she was saying we really do need to focus on energy on things that protesters and leaders are actually calling for, right? So I think we do sometimes have a habit as white people or as white liberals with an all-time high of white guilt, right? Like white guilt's kind of at this all-time high. We need to be careful not to fall into these traps where we do things that aren't actually moving the issue or really pushing the ball, but are really just there to make us feel better, right? So some of these commissions that get appointed that have no teeth to actually pass laws, or some of these resolutions that are passed in cities that are, you know, afraid to even say they're against racism, right? Who are those really for? Those are to make white people feel better, right? So we need to be careful to make sure we're still listening to the changes they want and not just putting in the changes that are going to make us feel better.
John, I 100% agree with that. 100%.
Yeah, I mean, who cares about our feelings right now? And I mean that. It shouldn't be about our feelings, right? It should not. We're here, we have to have these uncomfortable conversations, right? If they're going to appoint boards, it's not just a feel good, oh, here's a diversity board that's there in name only. Like, our feelings are not the focus.
I mean, look right here in Wyandotte County, we just appointed a commission on looking at the police department and racial inequality. And we here in Wyandotte County have the only Black DA in Kansas, the first ever Black DA elected in Kansas, and he wasn't even asked to be on the board. Wasn't even asked to be there. And the only Latino who was on the board, the only Latino man, actually recently just resigned from the board. So it's like, what are these things? What are the goals of these things, and who are we picking to be on these things? It happens again right in our own backyards.
Again, this is where I think about women's issues when you say this, because you look about, the federal government being like, let's make decisions about women's birth control. And you look at these tables filled with white men and you're like, who's making these decisions? Like, this is not, I don't know. We can help put people in power to make better decisions. We can help do that now, since we still have a lot of the power, because we want to be able to undo the things that have only benefited us. We want to be able to share that with everyone. We really do. I don't know how long.
I was going to say, we could do that by voting and getting other people to vote. I keep coming back to that because I think if there's one, I do. I'm sorry. It's the line of work that we're in, right? First of all, but second of all, like, if there's one thing we can do is change the problem, get rid of the problem.
Right.
And the problem is that Black people aren't in power.
Right. And not just vote, but lobbying and reaching out to your representatives. You can email, I don't enjoy doing phone calls necessarily, but I will email, I will text, and you can talk to your representatives every day if you want to, and say, look, I'm still saying this is something I want. This is something we need. And so it isn't just down to the 2 or 3 times a year that you might vote. You can be lobbying and you can be writing to your representatives on a district level, on a state level, on a nationwide level, all the time and every day. And just so that they understand, here's what the people want. These are the people's voices. This is what they're asking for, and keeping those issues relevant for your lawmakers.
Well said. All right, friends, thank you so much for agreeing to be on this panel with me today, and just putting everything out there, everything we've learned, everything we still have to learn. As I mentioned earlier, this isn't over, not far from. So thank you very much for being with us. Hope to be in contact with you in the future. Maybe we can share more of what we learned and what we're doing to make things better. And I'd also like to thank our guests and everyone out there for joining us today. This isn't the end. We have a long way to go until we achieve the founding principles of our nation and we realize true equity. But first, we have to admit, as we found here today, that our society is broken. We must own that we have routinely marginalized certain populations, including people of color, whether intentional or not, and it needs to stop. So we're all urging you to stand up and speak out, to engage in dialogue that affects meaningful change. And remember, we're not all in the same place on this journey. So make sure to meet others where they are and bring them along. The most important elections of my lifetime anyway are coming up on August 4th and November 3rd. So please visit thevoternetwork.org and find out how you can make change this August and this November. And please drop in the comments, what would you like to hear about next? What conversation can we have next on continuing the conversation? Until the next time, stay safe out there. Remember to do more than vote. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.